There is a scene in Robert Kirkman's original script notes for Negan's introduction that was never filmed. It's not a violent scene, it's almost the opposite. It involves Negan alone, in the middle of the night, doing something so specific and so quietly human that it would have changed how every scene that followed it landed. People who read early drafts of the Season 7 scripts have described it as the moment that made Negan make sense. Not as a monster, but as a person who had made a series of very deliberate choices about who to become. A MC pulled it. The reasons, depending on who you ask, range from runtime concerns to network notes to a fundamental disagreement about whether a show called The Walking Dead was allowed to make its villain too understandable. The scene was never filmed. The version of Negan it was building toward was never fully realised on screen. And the show spent the next 4 seasons trying to recover the depth it lost in that single decision. Tonight, we're going to trace exactly what was cut, why it mattered, and what the show might have looked like if it had aired. Before we can talk about what the show changed, we need to understand what it was working from. Robert Kirkman introduced Negan in issue 100 of The Walking Dead comic, published in July 2012. The issue was one of the most anticipated in the comic's run. Readers had been building toward it for months, through increasingly ominous references to the Saviours and their reach, through whispered warnings from communities that had already encountered them, through the particular tension that the comic generates when it's about to do something it can't take back. Readers knew something significant was coming. They knew the bat. What they didn't know was the scope of what Kirkman had built. Negan is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most fully realised villains in the history of American comics. Not because he's the most powerful or the most frightening, though he is genuinely frightening, but because Kirkman gave him an interior life that most villains don't get. He gave him a code, a history, a specific set of beliefs about the world and his place in it that are internally consistent, even when they're monstrous. The core of comic Negan is this. He genuinely believes he's making things better, not in a deluded way, not in the way that cartoon villains believe their terrible plans are secretly good for everyone. Negan has looked at the world after the apocalypse, examined what it actually requires to survive and to build communities that can last, and arrived at a set of conclusions that are cold and brutal, and on a certain narrow logic, defensible. He believes that strength is the only real currency in a world where the institutions that used to enforce cooperation have collapsed entirely. He believes that without someone willing to perform absolute dominance, communities collapse into chaos and everyone dies. He believes he is the thing standing between the people around him and a world that would consume them. He has also, in his own mind, imposed limits on himself. He doesn't allow rape within his community. He doesn't allow random killing of the people who pay tribute to him. He has rules and he enforces those rules with the same violence he uses on outsiders. Because the rules are not a performance of decency. They're functional constraints that he has decided are necessary for the system to work. A society built on fear still needs to be predictable. You can't control people through terror if the terror is arbitrary. They have to know what the rules are so that following the rules feels like a viable option. This doesn't make him right. The comic is explicit that he isn't right, but it makes him interesting in a way that pure sadism never could, because it means you can argue with him. His position has internal logic. It responds to evidence. And several characters in the comic do argue with him, most notably Rick and eventually Carl, and those arguments are some of the richest material in the entire run. There are pages where Negan is making a case that you can feel the intellectual weight of, even as the story is simultaneously demonstrating everything wrong with the conclusion he's reached. Kirkman also gave Negan a backstory that the comic parcels out slowly and deliberately, with the care of someone who understands that the timing of a revelation matters as much as the revelation itself. Before the apocalypse, Negan was a high school gym teacher. He was married to a woman named Lucille, the same name he gave his bat, and she was dying of cancer when the world ended. He wasn't a particularly good person before the apocalypse. He cheated on Lucille. He was volatile, charming, self-serving, the kind of man who was magnetic enough that people forgave him things they shouldn't have. But he loved her, in the complicated way people love people they have also failed repeatedly, and her death, which happened during the early chaos of the outbreak, is the wound underneath everything. The bat named Lucille is not just a weapon. It's not just a menacing prop chosen for visual effect. It's a grave marker. It's the thing he carries so he never has to stop carrying her. The name is an act of devotion so warped by grief that it's become almost unrecognisable as devotion. He wrapped barbed wire around the bat, the same way that some people wrap themselves around their grief so completely that it becomes part of the structure of their personality. Understanding that doesn't excuse what he does with it, but it changes the register of it. It adds a dimension of grief to the violence that makes the violence mean something beyond itself, that roots the brutality in a specific human history, rather than leaving it floating free as pure spectacle. The show inherited all of this material. It had the comics. It had Kirkman as a producer with ongoing involvement in the series. It had Jeffrey Dean Morgan in the role, an actor specifically chosen for his ability to make Menace feel human. It had every tool it needed to bring this version of Negan to the screen. It's also worth noting, before we get into what the show changed, the degree to which the comic Negan was itself a departure from what post-apocalyptic fiction had previously done with the villain role. The genre has a long tradition of antagonists who are simply stronger, simply more ruthless, simply more willing to do the terrible things that the protagonists hesitate to do. These villains serve a clear narrative function. They represent the endpoint of survival logic, the version of the world that exists if you follow the premise of might makes right all the way to its conclusion. They're useful as threats and as foils, but they're not interesting as people because they don't have interior lives that complicate their function. Negan in the comics is a genuine departure from that tradition. He's a villain who has thought about what he's doing, who has developed a philosophy of it, who can articulate arguments for his position that require actual engagement rather than simple refusal. He's also a villain who's doing something that the story is honest about being, in certain narrow ways, effective. The people under his dominion survive. They're fed and protected. The price is high and the payment is humiliating, but the transaction delivers something real, and the story doesn't pretend otherwise. That honesty is what made the comic's Negan arc one of the most discussed in the book's history, and it's what the show was attempting to translate and ultimately found it couldn't quite commit to. What it chose to do with those tools is a more complicated story. Jeffrey Dean Morgan was announced as Negan in April 2016, and the reaction from fans and critics was immediate and almost universally positive. Morgan was not an obvious choice in the way that some casting decisions are obvious. He wasn't a household name in the way that would generate headlines purely on recognition. He wasn't a veteran character actor with a specific kind of gravitas that would signal a prestige approach to the material. He was, at that point, best known for a handful of well-regarded supporting turns and a warmth on screen that translated into genuine likability without being too soft or too unthreatening to read as dangerous, which was exactly why it worked. Morgan has something rare, which is the ability to be immediately likable while communicating that the likability is a performance. You watch him and you feel the warmth, and you also feel, underneath it, the calculation. He smiles and you believe the smile, and you also don't quite trust it. And you can't always articulate why, and that gap between the surface and what's underneath it is precisely what Negan requires. A purely threatening actor would have made Negan easy to dismiss. A purely charming one would have made the violence feel like a betrayal of character. Morgan can hold both at once, can let the charm and the menace exist in the same gesture, which is exactly the experience of being in a room with someone like Negan. The casting suggested that the show understood what it had. It suggested that the writers were going to build toward the comics version of the character, rather than flattening him into something the network was more comfortable with. Morgan himself gave interviews in the lead up to the premiere, talking about the complexity he was finding in the role, about the research he'd done into the comics and beyond them, about the specific humanity he was trying to locate underneath the performance of Menace. He talked about Negan as a character with a fully formed interior life that the scenes didn't always let him show, but that he needed to know was there in order to play the scenes convincingly. That's an actor who has been given something real to work with, or who has found something real to work with in spite of what he's been given, which, as we'll discuss, is part of what makes Morgan's performance so interesting to examine closely. The promise of the casting was a Negan who scared you and fascinated you in equal measure, a villain you couldn't look away from for reasons that went beyond the violence, that had something to do with the particular quality of his attention and the sense that there was more happening in him than what you were being allowed to see. There's also a practical argument for why the casting was the right choice that goes beyond the quality of Morgan's performance. Negan, as written in the comics, is a character whose charm is load-bearing. The system he's built requires people to choose compliance, to decide that working with Negan is preferable to the alternative, and that decision only makes sense if Negan offers something beyond the threat. He's persuasive. He can make people feel in certain moments genuinely valued by him. He knows how to identify what someone needs to hear and give them a version of it that serves his purposes without feeling entirely false. That's a very specific skill in a performer, and it's not the skill you're necessarily looking for when you're casting a heavy. Morgan had it, which meant the show had, in theory, everything it needed to build the version of Negan the comics had spent years constructing. That promise was partially kept and partially broken. And the way it was broken tells you a great deal about the decisions being made above the level of the actors and the writers' room. The writers' room for Season 7 was working with one of the richest villain introductions in the history of the source material, and a mandate from the network to deliver something that would bring back the massive audience the show had built at its peak and started losing in the back half of Season 6. By most accounts, the early drafts of the Negan episodes went significantly further than what aired, not only in terms of violence, which is what the eventual controversy focused on almost exclusively, but in terms of interiority. The writers were working toward a version of the character that gave the audience access to his inner logic in a way that the show had never done with an antagonist before. The Governor, in Seasons 3 and 4, was explored with some depth, but his psychology was ultimately rooted in trauma and madness, in ways that made him more pitiable than intellectually confrontational. Negan was supposed to be different. He was supposed to be someone whose worldview you had to actually engage with, rather than simply classify as the result of damage. The scene referenced in our opening is one of several that were developed in this period, and ultimately didn't make it through the production process. The specific scene involved Negan alone in the sanctuary, in the early hours of the morning, sitting with the bat in a room where no one else was present, and no performance was required. Not doing anything dramatic, not building toward a speech or a threat or a display of power. Just sitting with it, talking to it, quietly, the way you might talk to a photograph of someone you've lost or a letter you wrote that you'll never send. Telling Lucille, the real Lucille, about the day he'd just had, about the decisions he'd made, about whether he thought she would understand them, about whether he thought she would recognise him. It was a scene that lasted maybe 3 minutes in the draft. It didn't advance the plot in any conventional sense. It didn't introduce new information about the world or the story's direction. What it did was give you a window into the private version of Negan that existed behind the public performance, the one that was still, in some compartmentalised and maybe broken way, accountable to the woman he'd loved and failed and named his weapon after. The one that went home at the end of the day and sat in the dark and talked to a bat, because that was the only place left where he could be honest about what any of it was costing him. The writers understood that this scene was the key to everything that followed, because once you had seen it, every subsequent scene of Negan terrorising Rick's community had a second layer. You were watching the performance now, not just the effect. You were watching a man who had decided, consciously and with full awareness, to become something specific, and who went home at night and sat with the cost of that decision in private. The violence didn't disappear. The horror of what he did didn't become acceptable, but it became legible in a way that changed your relationship to it. You were in the position of knowing something about Negan that his victims didn't know, and that Negan would never admit to anyone who could use it against him, and that knowledge created exactly the kind of complicated engagement that makes long-form character study work. That's not comfort, it's not absolution. It's the specific discomfort of having to think about a person who does terrible things rather than simply reacting to the terrible things they do. The show pulled the scene, and in pulling it, it pulled the thread that everything else was supposed to hang on. To understand why the deeper version of Negan didn't make it to air, you have to understand the position AMC was in heading into season 7. The Walking Dead had been the most watched show on cable television for several years running. Its season 5 premiere drew over 17 million viewers. By season 6, that number had begun to decline, and while the show was still a cultural event, in a way that few basic cable series ever managed to be, there was an anxiety in the production about the direction of the numbers. The season 6 finale, which ended on the cliffhanger of Negan's introduction, and the moment before he brought the bat down, was a creative gamble meant to generate maximum anticipation for what came next. It generated maximum frustration instead, and the months between the finale and the premiere were dominated by commentary about the manipulation of the cliffhanger rather than excitement about the new villain. The show arrived at the season 7 premiere in a compromised position. It needed to deliver something extraordinary, needed to justify the cliffhanger and the weight and the investment of the entire preceding season in building toward this moment. The pressure to deliver was enormous, and that pressure expressed itself in a predictable way, which was to prioritise the immediate visceral impact over the structural complexity that the character's best version required. The mandate, as it filtered down through the production, was to deliver something visceral and undeniable. Something that would trend on social media, something that would be talked about at work on Monday morning, something that would remind a drifting audience that The Walking Dead was still capable of the kind of television event that made it culturally unmissable in its peak years. What got squeezed out in that mandate was nuance, because nuance takes time, and time was already in short supply in a premiere that had to deliver the aftermath of a season-long cliffhanger and establish a new status quo while also justifying its own extreme content to a network and a standards and practices department that was watching closely. A 3-minute scene of Negan talking to a bat in an empty room requires the audience to slow down, to sit with something quiet and private and not immediately dramatic, to do interpretive work rather than simply react. That's a harder sell when your primary goal is to recapture a mass audience that you're afraid has stopped trusting you. There was also, by several accounts, a network-level concern about making Negan too sympathetic too early. The argument, as articulated in various forms in the years since, was that the show needed the audience to hate Negan before it could afford to humanise him. That the emotional logic of the narrative required a clear villain in the early stages of the arc, and that complicating the villain before the audience had fully processed his villainy would create a tonal confusion that would undermine the story's ability to generate the kind of clear moral stakes that keep audiences engaged with a conflict over multiple seasons. This is a reasonable concern on its surface. It's also, on reflection, exactly wrong, because the tonal complexity is not an obstacle to the story working. The tonal complexity is the story. The audience's inability to simply hate Negan, their experience of finding themselves fascinated and disturbed by their own fascination, their awareness that the person doing these terrible things has an interior life that the terrible things don't fully account for. All of this is the engine that was supposed to drive the next several seasons. Removing that complexity in the early episodes didn't protect the audience from confusion. It just made Negan smaller. It reduced him from something genuinely difficult to think about into something you could manage by simply deciding he was a monster and treating him accordingly. The show spent the rest of its Negan arc trying to retrofit the complexity it had cut. It never fully succeeded, not because the later material was bad, but because complexity that comes after the fact operates differently than complexity that's present from the beginning. When you meet someone and they're simply dangerous, and then years later you learn about their grief, the grief becomes an explanation. It retroactively accounts for the danger. But it doesn't change the foundation of your relationship with them, which was formed in the absence of that information. When you meet someone and the grief is present from the start, woven into the danger, part of the texture of every encounter, the grief becomes part of the person, rather than an explanation of them. That's a fundamentally different relationship. And the show gave itself no way to build the second kind by starting with the first. The Season 7 premiere aired on October 23rd, 2016, and generated more formal complaints to the FCC than any episode of The Walking Dead before or since. Thousands of viewers filed objections. Critics were divided sharply, with some arguing that the violence was artistically purposeful, and others calling it gratuitous and exploitative. Social media responses ranged from viewers who felt viscerally affected in the way great drama is supposed to affect you, to viewers who felt manipulated and alienated and announced they were done with the show. AMC thought they had made a compromise. The violence in the premiere was, by the standards of what the writers had originally envisioned, already a significant pullback from the most extreme material that had been in earlier drafts. The network had pushed for restraint in several specific areas. What remained was the result of negotiations between what the writers wanted, what the network would allow, and what could be defended to an increasingly scrutinising media environment. What's interesting, looking back, is that the complaints were almost entirely about what was in the episode, about the extended depiction of Abraham's death and Glenn's death, about the particular physical detail of it, about how long it lasted and what it asked the audience to look at for how long. Very few people were talking about what wasn't there. The absence doesn't generate complaints the way the presence does. You can't be upset about a scene you never saw, can't identify the specific texture of what was missing, can't point to an empty space and say that this is where the show lost me. The people who felt something was wrong about the premiere mostly articulated it as a problem with what was there, with the gratuitousness, with the feeling of being asked to endure without being given enough meaning to justify the endurance. But what they were responding to, in part, was the flatness of the episode's Negan, a character who was present entirely as force, as event, as cause of suffering. A character with no private life visible anywhere in the frame. The scene that would have given the suffering a second layer, that would have placed it in relationship to something interior and specific and human, had been cut, and the premiere proceeded without it, which meant the premiere was asking the audience to absorb an enormous amount of darkness without giving them the handhold that would have made the absorption feel like it was going somewhere. The Season 7 ratings tell the story that followed. The premiere drew 17 million viewers. By the end of the season, that number had fallen below 8 million. Roughly half the audience that showed up for the premiere did not stay through the season finale. That is one of the most dramatic single-season audience collapses in the history of major American drama, and it happened to a show that was not otherwise in structural crisis, that had capable writers and extraordinary actors, and a production infrastructure that was as good as anything on television. The conventional explanation is pacing. Season 7 is, by almost universal agreement, a structurally troubled season. It splits the group across multiple storylines and spends far too long with each satellite community before bringing the threads back together. The hilltop episodes, the kingdom episodes, the long stretches with Carol and Morgan. The momentum that the premiere built dissipates over the following weeks in ways that are frustrating, even for viewers who are genuinely engaged with the central Negan dynamic. But the pacing problem and the Negan problem are not separate. The reason the season needed the satellite storylines needed to spread itself so wide to maintain interest was partly that the Negan storyline itself didn't have enough interior depth to sustain the focus on its own. If you have a villain who is genuinely fascinating at the level of character, rather than just threatening at the level of event, you can spend 10 episodes in his orbit and have it feel like a revelation, rather than a marathon. If you have a villain who is compelling only as a source of threat, you need to keep varying the scenery to maintain interest, because the character himself isn't generating enough to look at. The show had the villain that could have generated enough to look at. It just removed the most important parts of him before anyone outside the production got to see them. One of the most significant casualties of the decision to flatten Negan's early appearances is the Lucille backstory, which the show handled in a way that is instructive about everything that went wrong with the arc as a whole. In the comics, Negan's history with his wife is revealed slowly, in fragments, over years of publication. You get pieces of it at unexpected moments, dropped into conversations that seem to be about something else entirely, surfacing in the middle of scenes that are ostensibly about strategy or negotiation, or the mechanics of the tribute system, a reference to a woman's name, a particular quality of attention when someone around him mentions cancer or hospitals or the early days of the outbreak, the way he handles the bat in certain quiet moments that has a different character from the way he handles it as a weapon. It accumulates in the way that actual grief accumulates, not as a tidy backstory delivered in a dedicated flashback episode that the audience can process and set aside, but as something that keeps surfacing unbidden, attached to objects and phrases and moments that shouldn't matter as much as they do. By the time Kirkman gives you the full story, you've already felt the weight of it for dozens of issues. The revelation doesn't create the weight. It explains the weight that was already there. The show, in contrast, eventually gave Negan's backstory its own episode. Season 10's Here's Negan, a dedicated 40-some-minute flashback that covers the pre-apocalypse relationship between Negan and Lucille, her cancer diagnosis, their marriage's complications, her death, and Negan's immediate aftermath in the first days of the outbreak, is one of the best episodes the show produced in its later seasons. Jeffrey Dean Morgan is extraordinary in it, finding registers of softness and fear and grief that the earlier seasons never gave him permission to access within the main storyline. Hilary Burton Morgan, his real-life wife, plays Lucille, and the casting creates an intimacy and an ease between the two characters that feels immediately authentic, the specific comfort of people who know each other's rhythms completely, even when those rhythms are strained by illness and old resentments and the impending end of the world. The episode is directed with patience and restraint. It takes its time. It trusts the audience to sit with small moments and quiet conversations rather than constantly moving toward the next event. It earns its emotion rather than manufacturing it through music and cutting. In a better version of the show's timeline, it would be the kind of episode you could point to and say, this is what this show is capable of when it slows down and lets its characters be people. But it aired in season 10, 4 full seasons after Negan's introduction in season 7. The problem isn't that the episode is bad. The problem is what its tardiness reveals. The show knew this material existed. The writers knew the Lucille backstory was the key to making Negan work as a character rather than just as a threat. They always knew it. The episode is too well constructed, too clearly thought through, for it to represent a sudden discovery of something that had been overlooked. Someone was holding this back. Someone made a decision, repeatedly, and across multiple seasons, that it wasn't time yet, that the audience wasn't ready, that the character needed to establish something else first before you gave them this. By the time the show gave the audience the interior Negan that the character always required, a significant portion of the audience that might have been transformed by it had already left. The people watching in season 10 were the committed viewers, the ones who had stayed through the rough middle years, on faith or loyalty or genuine investment in the world the show had built. They got a beautiful episode. But the millions of people who had watched the season 7 premiere and then drifted away over the following months never got it. They made their decision about Negan based on the version of him that the show was willing to offer them in those early episodes, and that version wasn't enough to keep them. What Here's Negan demonstrates in retrospect is that the choice to defer Negan's interior life was not forced on the show by the limitations of the material. It was a choice, and it was the wrong choice, made repeatedly and with evidence accumulating on the side of changing course, until the moment when changing course was no longer structurally meaningful. Beyond the broader questions of interiority and backstory, there are specific documented instances of material that was written, and in some cases filmed and removed before airing. The most discussed among fans involves the aftermath sequence of the lineup scene. In the version of the episode as written in early drafts, before the episode went through its final round of network notes and editing decisions, there was an extended exchange between Negan and the surviving group that went beyond what made it to screen in both length and register. The version that aired has Negan processing the aftermath in a mode of pure performance, addressing the group from a position of total and demonstrated control, making clear through every line and gesture that there is no ambiguity about the new order of things. He's giving a speech. He's establishing terms. He's managing an audience. The cut version had him doing something slightly different in a specific section of that exchange. After the main speech, after the practical business of the new arrangement had been communicated, there was a moment where Negan stopped performing and simply watched. Watched Rick's group in their grief. Not with enjoyment, not with satisfaction, not with any of the obvious emotional responses that a straightforwardly villainous character might display in that moment, but with a very specific and controlled attention that read, to anyone watching carefully, as something closer to recognition. He had seen grief like this before. Was the thing the scene was communicating. He had been the one inside it. He understood what these people were experiencing not as an abstraction or as information about their psychology, but as something he had lived through from the inside. And he was watching them partly because grief, in his cosmology, is information about what someone will do next and whether they can be worked with. But only partly. There was something else in the watching, something that wasn't purely strategic, and that Negan himself probably could not have fully articulated if asked. It's a small difference on paper, a few seconds in a long scene. But in performance, in the specific register of how Morgan was playing that version of the character, it changed the scene significantly. Because it meant Negan was present as a full person during the killing, rather than as a performance of killing. It meant there was an inner life operating alongside the outer event, a person who remembered things, who carried things, who was in some involuntary and unwanted way connected to what was happening in front of him by the specific shape of his own losses. That version didn't air. The scene was trimmed to remove the moment of recognition and what it implied about the connection between Negan's past and his present. What remained was Negan as pure event, pure cause, pure source of what was happening to Rick and the others. More effective as immediate drama, less effective as character, less effective as the foundation for 4 more seasons of story that were going to need the audience to continue finding him interesting. There are also documented instances of dialogue cuts across multiple early Negan episodes that removed what might be called the philosophical content of his speeches in favour of the theatrical content. In the comics, Negan talks. He explains himself at considerable length, and not in the way that fictional villains explain their plans as a prelude to the heroes foiling them. He explains his worldview. He makes arguments about what the post-apocalyptic world requires, and what the alternatives to his system look like, and why he believes his way, brutal as it is preferable to the chaos that exists in its absence. These explanations are sometimes self-serving, and sometimes genuinely insightful, and sometimes both at once, and the tension between those registers is what makes them worth listening to. The show gave Negan long speeches. Jeffrey Dean Morgan delivered them with the full range of his considerable ability. But the speeches were filtered to emphasise the theatrical elements, the intimidation and the provocation and the dark humour at the expense of the argumentative elements. One of the more specific examples involves an exchange that was written for the 2nd or 3rd episode of Season 7, during one of Negan's visits to Alexandria. In the version that reached early production, there was a longer conversation between Negan and Rick that went beyond the dominance dynamic the aired version established. Negan was making an argument, explicitly, about what Rick's approach to the post-apocalyptic world had cost his community, about the number of people who had died under Rick's leadership, while Rick was trying to maintain something that looked like the old world's moral code, about whether the death toll of Rick's principles was meaningfully different from the death toll of Negan's pragmatism, and what it would mean if it wasn't. It's a genuinely uncomfortable argument because it has genuine truth in it. Rick has lost a lot of people. The choices he's made in the name of maintaining certain lines have sometimes cost as much as or more than the lines were worth. Negan naming this in front of the community in a way that required Rick to actually respond rather than just endure was a different kind of threat from the physical one. It was a threat to the narrative Rick's leadership was built on. The story that the suffering was in service of something, that the costs were purchases rather than simply losses. That version didn't air. The conversation was trimmed to remove the argument and keep the dominance dynamic cleaner. Comic Negan argues a position and invites you to engage with it even when you find it repellent. Show Negan performs dominance and dares you to respond to it. The performance is effective as television in the short term. The argument is what makes the character worth caring about over a multi-season arc, because an argument can develop and respond to evidence and change over time in ways that a performance can only repeat or escalate. Something worth acknowledging because it complicates the simple narrative of network interference ruining a great character, is the degree to which what made it to screen was elevated by Jeffrey Dean Morgan's performance, in ways that partially compensated for what the writing removed. Morgan found in the material he was given more than the material strictly contained. This is not unusual for very good actors working with imperfect material, but the degree to which Morgan's performance creates the impression of interiority that the scripts withheld is remarkable enough to deserve specific attention. In scenes that were written purely for dominance and spectacle, he introduced flickers of something else, moments where Negan's attention shifted in a way that wasn't entirely about control. Moments where the charm shaded into something that felt like genuine amusement, genuine curiosity, genuine investment in the people he was terrorizing, rather than simply enjoyment of their terror. The scenes between Negan and Carl in Season 7 are the clearest example of this. The writing gave Morgan a version of those scenes that was functional, that communicated the required dynamic, that moved the plot in the direction it needed to go. What Morgan brought to them was a specific quality of recognition. He played Negan as someone who saw in Carl something that he understood from the inside, something about the experience of having to choose what kind of person to become when the world stopped providing a template, something about the choice to make yourself into a weapon and what that costs in private. That recognition lives in Morgan's eyes and in the particular quality of his stillness in those scenes, in the way his attention focuses on Carl differently from how it focuses on everyone else, as if Carl is the one person in Rick's group who is doing something genuinely interesting. It's not in the script in any explicit way. Morgan put it there through the quality of his attention, through small physical choices, through the specific way he allows silence to develop in those scenes rather than filling it with performance. And it's the thing that made those Carl and Negan exchanges feel like something more than the rest of the season managed to be. That gave them a weight and an intimacy that the surrounding episodes couldn't match. But what Morgan was doing in those moments was showing the audience glimpses of a window that the show hadn't opened. He was communicating the existence of an interior life without being given the material to fully demonstrate it. And there's a limit to what even a very good actor can accomplish in that position, because the audience can feel the glimpse and find it tantalizing, but they can't follow through the window into the room beyond it if the room doesn't exist in the text. Morgan gave the audience glimpses of the interior Negan. What he couldn't give them was the foundation underneath those glimpses, the 3-minute scene in the sanctuary, the specific grief that explained everything else and changed the register of everything else. That had to come from the writing, and when the writing withheld it, the glimpses remained glimpses rather than revelations, suggestive rather than foundational, enough to make you feel that something was there without giving you enough to actually hold. The Negan arc in the comics runs from issue 100 to roughly issue 174, covering several years of publication and some of the most narratively ambitious material Kirkman ever produced. Over that period, Kirkman does something that the show never quite managed, which is to allow Negan to be genuinely wrong and genuinely right in the same story, without resolving the tension between those two things. The comic is honest about the fact that Negan's model of community, brutal and exploitative, as it is, works in the narrow sense that the communities he controls survive. They are fed, they are protected from external threats. The tribute system functions as a kind of taxation that funds a protective infrastructure. And while the terms of that taxation are humiliating and the enforcement is violent, the communities that pay it are, by the measurable metrics of survival, better off than they were before Negan imposed order on the region. Rick's objection to Negan is not that Negan's way doesn't produce results. It's that the cost of those results is too high. That the kind of human beings Negan's system produces, diminished and frightened and systematically stripped of agency, are not the kind of human beings worth building a civilization from. That argument is made explicitly in the comic, across dozens of issues, with accumulating weight and genuine evidence on both sides. There are moments where Rick's position seems clearly correct, and moments where Negan's position seems uncomfortably defensible. And the sustained tension between those two experiences of the reader is one of the most sophisticated things long-form fiction can do. It uses the zombie apocalypse as a genuine thought experiment about what civilization requires and what it costs, and it arrives somewhere more honest than most political fiction manages precisely because it doesn't let either position win cleanly. There's a specific sequence in the comics during the period of Negan's imprisonment, after Rick's side wins the war, where Negan and Rick have an extended conversation through the bars of his cell that is one of the genuinely great pieces of writing in the whole run. Negan is making the case, from captivity, that Rick's mercy was a mistake, not as a threat, not as an attempt to manipulate Rick into releasing him, as an honest argument about what the new communities will face and whether they'll be capable of meeting it without someone like Negan to enforce the hardness the world still requires. And Rick, listening to this argument from the man who killed his friends and broke his son and took apart everything Rick had spent years building, has to actually engage with it rather than simply dismiss it, because the argument has enough truth in it to be uncomfortable. Because Negan is right about some things and wrong about others, and the line between the two is not as clear as Rick needs it to be. The show arrived at an equivalent exchange years later than it should have, and the delay robbed it of the structural weight it needed. By the time the show was willing to let Negan make that argument, too much had happened in the intervening seasons, too many episodes of a simpler Negan, for the uncertainty the scene required to fully take hold in the audience's experience. The argument landed, but it landed as a good scene, rather than as the culmination of a sustained moral interrogation that had been building for years. And there's a difference, and the difference is felt, even when it's hard to name precisely. The show wanted to tell this story. The ambition was evident in the casting, in Morgan's performance, in the particular attention the writers paid to certain exchanges in the early Negan episodes. But the story required an audience that was genuinely uncertain about Negan, and the show's early choices foreclosed that possibility. By removing the interior scenes, by filtering the philosophical content out of Negan's speeches, by optimizing for immediate emotional impact rather than sustained moral complexity, the show created a Negan that the audience could manage, that it could place in the category of villain and treat accordingly. And a Negan that can be managed that way cannot sustain the kind of story the comics were telling, because that story requires a villain you can never quite get comfortable with. There's a specific sequence in the comics during the period of Negan's imprisonment after Rick's side wins the war, where Negan and Rick have an extended conversation through the bars of his cell that is one of the genuinely great pieces of writing in the whole run. Negan is making the case, from captivity, that Rick's mercy was a mistake, not as a threat, not as an attempt to escape, as an honest argument about what the new communities will face and whether they'll be capable of meeting it without someone like Negan to enforce the hardness the world requires. And Rick, listening to this argument from the man who killed his friends and broke his son, has to actually engage with it rather than simply dismiss it, because the argument has enough truth in it to be uncomfortable. The show arrived at an equivalent scene years later than it should have, and the delay robbed it of the structural weight it needed to land. By the time the show was willing to let Negan make that argument, too much had happened in the interim, and the audience had been positioned too clearly against him for the uncertainty the scene required to fully take hold. The back half of Negan's time on the show, from roughly season 9 through the series finale, is a more successful story than the first half, and acknowledging that is part of giving the full picture. When Rick was written out at the beginning of season 9 and the show jumped forward in time, Negan in prison became one of the more genuinely interesting things the show was doing. The sanctuary, gone. The tribute system dissolved. The performance of dominance stripped away by years of captivity, and the slow transformation of the world outside his cell into something he no longer governed. The question that emerged from this, of whether the person underneath the performance could survive without the performance, of whether Negan minus the power and the bat and the leather jacket and the audience of followers was anyone at all, was a good question. One of the best questions the later seasons asked. And crucially, it was the question that the unaired version of the character had been setting up from the beginning. The private Negan, the one who sat in empty rooms with a bat and held himself accountable to a dead woman's memory, was the person who could survive the loss of everything external. The show just took 3 seasons to give you the pieces you needed to understand why. The dynamics between imprisoned Negan and Michonne are among the best material of the later seasons, because Michonne refuses to do either of the things that Negan's old dynamic required from people. She doesn't fear him, and she doesn't buy into his charm, and she doesn't hate him in a way that confirms his sense of his own significance. She engages with him as a person accountable for what he's done, holding him to account not through punishment, but through a specific quality of clear-eyed presence that is, for Negan, harder to manage than either hatred or fear. You can perform for people who fear you or hate you. You can't perform for someone who just sees you. Here's Negan, as discussed earlier, redeems a great deal of what the early seasons withheld. It gives you the interior man. It gives you Lucille. It gives you the specific shape of the wound underneath everything. Watching it as a season 10 episode, there is both the satisfaction of finally receiving what you were always owed, and the sadness of receiving it on a timeline that the story could no longer fully use. The Dead City spin-off extends these later developments in ways that largely honour the more complex version of the character the show eventually found. Negan in Dead City is not redeemed in any simple sense. He's not absolved. He's not presented as a good person who has successfully outrun his past. He's someone carrying the full weight of what he was, trying to figure out what that weight allows him to become. And the show treats that project with appropriate seriousness, and without the need to resolve it cleanly. It's a good place for the character to have ended up. The path to get there was longer and more wasteful than it needed to be. But the character survived the path, which is more than you could have said with confidence in the middle of season 7. This is the speculative part of the conversation, and it's worth being honest that it is speculative. We don't have the full early drafts, we don't have the pulled footage, we have accounts and interviews and fragments. The visible gaps in what aired and the shape of what those gaps suggest was supposed to fill them. But based on all of that, the picture of the unaired Negan is fairly coherent. He is a person who has made a conscious and ongoing choice to be what he is. Not a person who became a monster accidentally in the chaos of the apocalypse and lost himself in ways he didn't fully anticipate. A person who looked at the options the new world offered and selected one with clear eyes and accepted the costs. The bat named Lucille is part of that choice. It's a way of keeping the cost visible, of making sure he never gets to pretend that what he does is free, that there's a version of the life he's living that doesn't require him to account for Lucille. He also is, in some private and protected space, still grieving in a way that is not resolved, and probably never will be. Still talking to Lucille in empty rooms, still measuring his decisions against an internal version of her that he knows is not a fair witness because memory never is, because the Lucille in his memory is partly a construction of his guilt, and partly an idealisation of what they could have been, and he knows this and keeps the dialogue going anyway, because without it the version of himself that could feel the cost disappears entirely. And he needs that version of himself to remain present, even if only as a voice in an empty room, because that version is the thing that keeps him from becoming something worse than what he is. That version of Negan changes every subsequent scene he appears in. When he kills Abraham and Glenn, you are watching someone who will go home later and sit in the dark and account for it to a bat with a woman's name. When he stands in front of Rick's group performing absolute dominance, there is a version of him that is watching himself perform it, monitoring the performance from a remove, and you know that remove exists because the private grief exists. When he talks about his rules and his code and his system, you understand that the code is not only a control mechanism, it is also a structure he has built partly to contain himself, a set of limits that mark the line between what he does and what he refuses to do, and he enforces those limits with the same force he enforces everything else, because they matter to him in a way that has nothing to do with their utility. None of this makes him good, none of it makes what he does acceptable, or the suffering he causes less real. But all of it makes him true, and the version of the story built around a true Negan would have been, by almost any measure, one of the best things the show ever produced. The story of the unaired Negan is, in the end, a story about the relationship between commercial television and the kind of storytelling that requires an audience to sit with discomfort that doesn't resolve. The 3-minute scene in the sanctuary is not comfortable. It doesn't generate the immediate emotional response that a shock or a confrontation or a clear moment of triumph or defeat generates. It requires the audience to update their understanding of a character they've been set up to hate, to hold simultaneously in mind a person capable of the violence of the premiere and a person capable of the grief of that quiet room, and to resist the urge to resolve the tension by deciding which one is the real Negan and setting the other one aside. That's hard work. It's the kind of work that the best long-form drama has always asked of its audience. The Sopranos asked it with Tony Soprano for 6 seasons. The Wire asked it with nearly every significant character it ever created. Breaking Bad asked it with Walter White. And the whole shape of that show was built around the audience's slowly deteriorating ability to keep the two versions of Walter, the sympathetic one and the monstrous one, in balance with each other. The Walking Dead comic asked it repeatedly and got away with it, because the medium of comics has a different relationship with its audience, one that allows for the kind of slow accumulation of complexity over hundreds of pages that episodic television is structurally biased against. Television, especially commercial television airing on a network that needs to maintain viewership in the millions to justify its costs, is structurally biased toward legibility, toward emotional responses that are clean and strong and can be generated reliably across a diverse audience with widely varying levels of investment in the specific craft of the storytelling, toward villains you can hate and heroes you can root for, and moments that land with a clarity that asks the minimum amount of interpretive work from the maximum number of viewers. The Walking Dead spent its best seasons fighting against those incentives with some success. Its best material found ways to be genuinely difficult, genuinely interested in moral complexity, genuinely willing to ask the audience to hold irreconcilable things in mind at the same time, while still delivering enough momentum and event to hold the attention of an audience that was watching in real time, without the patience that comes from binging, and without the context that comes from already knowing how the story ends. The Walking Dead spent its best seasons fighting against those incentives with some success. Its best material found ways to be genuinely difficult, genuinely interested in moral complexity, genuinely willing to ask the audience to hold irreconcilable things in mind at the same time, while still delivering enough momentum and event to hold the attention of an audience that was watching in real time, without the patience that comes from binging, and without the context that comes from already knowing how the story ends. That balance is fragile. It requires consistent decisions at every level of the production, from the network to the showrunner to the writer's room to the editing bay, all pointing in the same direction. And at the exact moment it needed to be most sophisticated, most willing to trust the audience with the version of Negan that the story had been building toward, the decisions at the various levels of the production stopped pointing in the same direction. It's worth noting that this kind of misalignment is not unusual in long-running television. It's actually closer to the norm than the exception. The production conditions that television requires, the simultaneous development of multiple episodes, the constant pressure from networks and advertisers, the personnel changes that happen across multi-year productions, the audience feedback loops that influence creative decisions in real time, all of these create an environment where maintaining a coherent, long-term vision is genuinely difficult. Most shows don't maintain it. The ones that do, the ones we point to when we talk about what television can be at its best, are remarkable partly because they overcame conditions that were structurally working against them. The Walking Dead was capable of being one of those shows. It had been at various points. The decision to simplify Negan was not the inevitable result of making television at scale. It was a specific choice, made under specific pressures that a different set of decisions could have avoided. That's not comforting exactly. But it's honest, the loss was not inevitable. It was chosen. The unaired Negan is a monument to that misalignment. Not because what aired was bad television, because it wasn't, but because what didn't air was the version that would have made everything around it work better. That would have given the violence meaning beyond its most immediate register, that would have given the audience a reason to stay invested through the slow middle of a long story rather than drifting away when the immediate impact of the premiere faded. The version of Negan that made it to screen is memorable. Jeffrey Dean Morgan is one of the great television villain performers of his era, and that's real, and it belongs in any honest account of what the show achieved. The version that didn't make it is the one that would have been worth the discomfort. The scene in an empty room, the bat with a woman's name, the man who made himself into a monster and kept an honest private account of every cost. That Negan existed somewhere, in notes and drafts and the space between what was written and what survived the process of making television at scale. Some of it eventually made it to screen, in fragments, years later than it should have. Enough of it got through to show you the shape of what was always there. But the full version, the one that would have changed how you watched everything else, never aired. Sleep well.